Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm speaking with sports psychiatrist Dr. Carla Edwards. Carla, welcome.
Thanks, Dan. It is great to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
It's really fantastic to have you on. Before we get started, it would be wonderful to learn a little bit about you and your work.
Sure, thank you. I am a sports psychiatrist in Canada, so a little bit further away from you, but I've been working in sports psychiatry now about 15 years, but started my career as a regular bread and butter psychiatrist, managing mental health assessment and treatment and folks who struggle with their mental health. But my root passion has always been sports. I'm an athlete at heart and always have been, and so feel very privileged to have been able to merge my passions into a career. And it is true what they say: if you love what you do, you never work a day in your life. And I can honestly say, meeting with athletes every day, talking about various sports and performance and just life in general, and then seeing it translate for them is really, really fulfilling.
The term we have here is a jobby. It's a job and a hobby rolled into one.
No, it's a fantastic group to work with. We see in society the beauty of sport. We experience it. We watch it. We eat it up. But to be able to work alongside the athletes behind the scenes as well is really, really rewarding. And that also provides me a window into the humanity behind the scenes, which is an area that a lot of people don't see and don't understand or recognize. Again, I feel really privileged to be in that position because I think it's where we see their vulnerabilities and the true stories, and it's an interesting place to be, but one that I value.
Well, we're here today to talk about a paper you've written entitled Athlete Maltreatment in Sport. You're a sports psychiatrist, as you mentioned before. You started in what could be described as mainstream psychiatry, but you shifted over to sport. You say sport lies at the heart of your life. What sports did you participate in?
I was fortunate enough to have been raised in a sport-encouraged environment. I think the earlier we can expose our children to sports, the more likely they are to make sure it's a part of their lives. So my dad was a big influence for that. He was a teacher and coach, and my brother and I were very fortunate to have lots of exposure to the benefits of sports. So volleyball and basketball were my main early sports, and continued more through volleyball, played through university, and actually in the Newfoundland Hall of Fame for that, which is fantastic. So sport opened up a lot of doors for me, and I really appreciate that. And I think we see that in a lot of our athletes. They're able to really carve out paths in their lives related to their sport, provides them with a ton of opportunities and exposure and education and funding. So again, the positive parts of sport. But now I get to work with athletes from literally every sport, and some I don't know a lot about, like whether it's fencing or bobsleigh or various things. But it's a great opportunity to learn about it. And I find my patient athletes, sometimes my greatest teachers. But we can apply our principles and our knowledge and our approach to mental health to everybody, because we know that, and one of the biggest lessons that I've learned in my career is that these folks, even if they're world champions, Olympic champions, Super Bowl champions, premiership champions, they're still people. They're still real people who have the same challenges as everybody else. And sometimes their positions and their opportunities actually expose them to more risks than what the general population actually has exposure to or understands.
That's a really interesting thing to say, that the last point that you made, that the environment that these athletes, especially at the very highest level of sport, are within or are exposed to, actually might cause a greater prevalence of mental ill health, mental challenges. Is there actually data to demonstrate that, Carla?
Yeah, it's a great question. We do know that, a myth that's been long debunked is that athletes are not as prone to mental illness. It was long thought historically that, athletes, because they have, great lifestyles and they travel a lot and they make a lot of money, some of them, they have sponsors and, their faces are on billboards, that their lives are fantastic. But a lot of studies have been done over the years to actually show that athletes, at the very least, have the same incidence of mental illness as everybody else, but in fact, some sports make them more vulnerable to certain types of mental illness. For example, aesthetic sports where their uniforms are really small, they don't cover a lot of their bodies. There's a lot of pressure to be thin or to look good in those uniforms. Or, there's a belief that in certain sports, if you're lighter, you're faster. If you're lighter, you can jump higher. So sports like, anything that is aerial, anything where they need to jump, or anything where they need
Yep.
to go fast and be aerodynamic, cycling, sprinting, running, often there's a perception that they need to be as light as possible to do that. But so some athletes in those areas are more prone to eating disorders, for example, which can then lead to things like relative energy deficiency in sport, which then crosses into the physical realm. So definitely some sports certainly make athletes more prone to certain illnesses.
We're here today to unpack your paper on athlete maltreatment in sport. And it's felt like, Carla, that every year there's a horror story coming out of a different Olympic team whereby athletes have been maltreated. It seems all too common occurrence these days.
You're right. Athlete maltreatment has been certainly mentioned, at least in the media, for decades. It definitely has gained more exposure, and I really credit the USA gymnasts for that, for really creating the tsunami of awareness, I'll call it, where it's you can't deny it. It's there. It's in your face. You see the magnitude of survivors and what they had to go through. They told their stories in open court. It's been published many times. There have been movies and documentaries made about it. And there have been obviously big prison sentences handed down finally. And there have been a lot of individuals and organizations who were complicit in facilitating that abuse for many years that have been identified, and there have been consequences. So I think that really was the landmark situation in the world where really it was in your face, the tsunami of awareness. And since then, I think more and more groups have felt empowered to come forward with their stories. And in Canada alone right now, there are multiple groups of national sport organization athletes who have told their stories, even been invited to testify in front of the government around the abuse that they suffered at the provincial sport organization level, youth sports, national sports, from a variety of people. And the push here in Canada is really for a national inquiry to really lay bare, what everybody's been through and really try to change the trajectory of this. And you're right, we hear about this every year. It seems there's a headline. Every main sporting event, there's a headline, and none more clear than what's currently going on following the Women's World Cup in soccer. But, what we're really looking for is there meaningful change happening, not just on a major scope, a major sport. We'll see what happens in Spain. But if we see it on national TV, you can imagine what's going on not on TV, behind the scenes, even on the local levels that aren't making the headlines right now.
Maltreatment, it seems to me, encompasses the extreme, which is something you've alluded to over the last few minutes, but right the way through to possibly the more nuanced. And so whilst we want to target it head on, we also need to begin at the beginning, don't we? And really define what maltreatment is. And that probably sounds like quite an obvious and simplistic thing to do. But for me, as I say, I think if we've got case studies whereby, okay, there's serious maltreatment, but then also we've got case studies that are less than obvious. Perhaps they're nuanced, they're subtle, they're in a word here, in a behaviour there. We really need to get to grips with what maltreatment in sport is. Can you, I know this is where you start your paper, can you define maltreatment for us?
Yeah, I think you're making a really good point, Dan, because I truly believe that a lot of what we still see happening happens because people don't recognize that it's maltreatment, or they deny that it is. So without a clear definition, without clear examples of what defines that definition, people will always be able to plead that they just don't know, plead ignorance, I may say. So while we see things in social media all the time or on TV that very clearly to most of us constitutes harm to an athlete in some way, maltreatment, but others will argue that it's not. I remember clearly recently there was a complaint made here in Canada, again, to the Canadian Hockey League, around a coach who used to shower when the youth athletes were in the room. He'd come out with a towel on, and there was a big debate in social media about whether or not that was actually appropriate. And so I made comments about it, and I alluded to the paper, which clearly defined, and just made a statement that seemed obvious to me. Coaches or members of the athlete entourage or adults should not be in any state of disrobing around athletes. It seems very simple, but I got a lot of pushback around that because the argument typically is, well, that happened to me when I was a kid. My coach used to do that all the time. Why is that a big deal? It's just part of the culture. And I think that's a big problem is it's a lot of these things are accepted. They're defined as part of the culture. And therefore they perpetuate every year. So in my paper, what I tried to do is I looked at all the different publications that have been made about various, whether it's athlete abuse, athlete neglect, athlete harassment, abuse and neglect, athlete maltreatment, just really to try to merge all the concepts together, because I think we are all talking about the same thing, but it's getting missed because there are so many different words being used. So really it's, in my paper, I made the comment that maltreatment really constitutes any act that results in or has the potential to result in physical injuries or psychological harm. Right? And the definitions are there. However, I think what is also missed is the perpetrators or the witnesses or bystanders don't always appreciate or understand what is going to harm the other individual. Right? So we run into this in a lot of team settings. And I'm going to say that most abuse or most maltreatment cases don't start as an in-your-face, someone walks into a room and there it is. I'm going to say it starts very subtly, right? And the perpetrators are often, they test the waters and they need to understand what they can get away with within that setting. And then it just pushes more and more and more. And oftentimes, the athletes themselves aren't even aware, or the person who's the victim isn't always aware that they're actually being maltreated. I don't have the data on me, and I don't even know if the research is done, but in my own clinical practice, what I can say is every day I see victims of maltreatment in sport, every single day. Some days it's 3/4 of my day. I would argue that 50% of those people aren't even aware that they're being maltreated. So part of my role is to obviously provide a supportive, safe environment, where I work with these folks over long periods of time and provide a lot of education about what is appropriate treatment, what is safety, what should a safe work environment be, which really the athletic venue is the work environment for these athletes. What is acceptable behavior, what is appropriate, and how do they feel when they're exposed to certain things. And for some people, only over an extended period of time, and I'm going to say up to a couple of years for some people, do they come to the realization of, wow, am I being abused? And sometimes it's clear to me, but going directly at it isn't always therapeutic or helpful. So you have to be careful. But it's a lot about education. And so this paper is not just hopefully to educate organizations and coaches about appropriate behavior or not, but also athletes.
You mentioned there that perpetrators might be deliberately looking for testing the waters, if you like, with subtle ways of maltreating athletes. I'm assuming as well there are potentially coaches who aren't doing it deliberately, but are perhaps engaging in behaviors, forms of communication that they themselves don't realize could be considered maltreatment.
Yes, I believe so. And I think even, when we look at the high profile individuals who have been given jail time for their, what would seem clear to us, maltreatment behavior, they don't always acknowledge that what they're doing is wrong. They find a way to justify it. Right. And sometimes it's, I'll just say a coach for now. I'm not saying that it's always a coach that's involved, but
Of course.
obviously they work closely with the athletes on a daily basis. So they're humans. So they form different relationships with different athletes in a different way. So, I mean, it should always be just the straight up coach athlete relationship. It should never be anything beyond that. But sometimes there's an athlete that has different characteristics. So maybe one of their parents has passed away, or maybe they're living away from home, or maybe they're an exceptionally talented individual. There's usually something that makes that person stand out versus others. And the coach then, or whomever, will then create a different kind of relationship with them. And then it can often progress from there. In my experience, my clinical experience, it's rarely a single incident with a single athlete. Often it's a repeated pattern of behavior, and I think that is born in the fact that, again, they learn what they can do, what they can get away with, and what doesn't land them into difficulty. So it's definitely something to watch for. But there have been lots of publications on grooming behavior, what that looks like, how subtle it can be, or even just overt physical and psychological abuse. It does start subtly. I'll use an example of a team where it was a very abusive environment, very critical, harsh, humiliating for a group of people. So we'll say this team is 30 people. On this particular team, there were 10% of them who were targeted for inappropriate sexual comments. There were about 50% of this team that were targeted just for harsh, humiliating, crushing, punitive comments from this coach. And then there were the others who were not. So the others were sort of in a protective sphere. So this team, I got to know a number of the athletes over time, identified a pattern of behavior because I just heard so many stories from so many of the different athletes, but none of them identified that it was a problem because it was part of the culture and it was part of a winning team. So therefore, even more kind of lenience provided to them for that. When there was eventually an investigation, we were able to get an investigation, the coach was eventually fired. It was quite an interesting observation as to what happened within the dynamic of this team. The folks who were subject to sexual harassment were relieved. They were still very damaged by what happened, but they were relieved. Those who received the harsh psychological, physical harassment and abuse from the coach were relieved that they were no longer going to be subjected to that. But the folks who were never ever subjected to any of that aligned very closely with the coach, and it was a very polarizing effect on this team. So even within a group, depending on how the different people are treated, can have a very different psychological outcome on the people either involved or not involved.
How did you advise on this case?
This was a tricky one. This one was based in a university here in Canada. And again, it took, in the first year that I was involved with multiple players on this team, they were clearly affected by how they were being treated, but they didn't yet have the language or understanding that it was inappropriate. It was just understood that if you play for this team, for this coach, this is the way they are and this is what to expect. And this coach had been at this school for multiple generations of athletes. I would say 10 to 15 years. People and historically athletes had just left the program, and nobody asked why. So by the time I got involved with him, this was during the pandemic. There were 3 or 4 or 5 athletes who I was supporting from the same team, and it just seemed. For me, any one athlete is too much to be experiencing this. But when there's a clear constellation within a program, I felt that I needed to really help and do something about this. As a physician with adult patients, there's no mandatory reporting for maltreatment or abuse. So we have to be very careful around getting consent for that, recognizing the outcomes. And in this case, in sport in particular, there's a lot of fear of repercussions, sport-based repercussions, lack of opportunities, being deselected from a team. Those are some of the reasons that athletes don't report, or if they report, that nothing will be done and it will just continue and the environment will be even worse for them. So for many reasons, these athletes were reluctant to report. And so it did take, I'm going to say 2 years. Eventually it got to the point where an athlete almost took her own life because of this, what was happening. And the manipulation and the psychological abuse had just increased even more. So I was able to have the athlete give me consent to speak to the athletic director at this university. In not a specific terms about all the things that had happened, but just to put it on this person's radar. This was an athletic director I knew and trusted and respected, and I knew that if they knew what was happening in their house, they would not allow it. So that started the ball rolling, and the athlete then felt comfortable talking to that person, and then it opened up, and then we were able to get an opportunity for the school to start interviewing other athletes, and then an investigation was opened, etc. So, but it took 2 years to get to that point, partly because the reporting mechanism within that school was not optimal. So there were uh, term limits on, or limitations on reporting. It had to happen within 6 months, and the respondent would know about the claims, and again, it would put the athletes at risk. So they were very reluctant to report, again, until it got to the point where it just didn't matter anymore. It just had to happen. So again, a positive outcome, but to eventually, by the end of it, it was 3 years later, and there was great human cost. Thankfully, no one took their lives, but I'm going to tell you, it was close a couple times.
What I heard you say there is that because this was an adult environment, there wasn't a process for reporting. And it strikes me that, I mean, if we think of power threat relationships, that, age isn't necessarily a mediator of that. Power threat relationships still exist in the adult world, don't they?
100%, yes. In terms of mandatory reporting, as physicians, we can report a child's being abused by anybody. That is mandatory. We can do that without consent. Very clearly, as an adult, and I've sought legal advice around this. I've been told that if I do report without consent, then I'm at risk of having a complaint lodged against my license, or a lawsuit. So it is important. So in that case, where there is, if the adults are at risk, and I believe that power differential exists anytime there's a coach-player relationship, no matter what the age. If they're even just within sport administrators, organizational staff, there's always that power differential. And so therefore, I think it even places adults even at more risk, because there are really fewer protections if there's not strict oversight and somebody acting on their behalf.
A power threat relationship always exists just by default. In the paper, you present the audience with different types of maltreatment. Again, this might feel like it's playing to the obvious, but I don't think it is. You unpack in the paper those types, the types being abuse, harassment, neglect, bullying, discrimination. It feels, and I don't think I'm going to formulate a question, but just a comment, it feels like, given the case study that you've spoken about there, that educational processes are important here, that maybe we need to look at every single program from high school to club to college and beyond as having some kind of entry point of education around these types of maltreatment, because when the athlete themselves understands what maltreatment potentially looks like, then they have a greater chance to not just report it, okay, that's obvious, but also just to identify it.
Absolutely. It's absolutely very important. One of the challenges we encounter in youth sports is the desperate need for coaches, or people to be trainers or volunteers with the department or with the organization. And if we think, I mean, in Canada, I think there are 200,000 volunteers that cover youth soccer every year. I can't imagine a larger country, or even globally, how many volunteer coaches or administrators or trainers there are, and then requiring all of them to have educational content before they do that. I think that is the barrier oftentimes, is how to deliver that, how to police that, and then sort of how to follow up with that. It is extremely important. Screening for maltreatment is something I do with every single one of my athletes, no matter how old they are. I talk to every set of parents about, what their relationships are like with the coaching staff or others, and how their children feel in that environment. But I think, again, I alluded to this earlier around the culture and what's acceptable. I think even parents sometimes will go along with what a coach is saying or requiring, because they believe it's what's going to get their child to be a professional in that sport or to the next level. I know here there was a situation I heard about from my tennis coach here, who talked about one of their coaches in the organization one time, who used to require their youth athletes to practice in bare feet in tennis on a hard court for hours, just to, and it's a form that would be a form of physical abuse,
Yes.
where, obviously it's creating physical harm. It clearly would cause damage to their feet. And there were parents who were upset that that coach didn't require their kids to also run barefoot for hours on the hard court, because they felt their child was then going to be at a disadvantage for making it to the next level. So it's the culture, the gaslighting, the brainwashing that goes on to convince otherwise rational people that this type of behavior is okay and acceptable and encouraged. It's just remarkable.
I'd like to talk more about what is and what potentially isn't acceptable within coaching. Some of the stuff you've spoken to already about the encouragement of bringing more coaches into the industry, that this topic interacts with the craft of coaching, that we need more coaches, but we also need better coaches who have the capabilities and the skills to be able to encourage their participants in healthy and safe ways. And that's vital. And I want to talk more about that. What I do want to do, again, coming back to the specifics of this paper, and again, I want to come back to the different types of maltreatment, because for instance, you've mentioned a tennis example there of physical abuse. What is abuse? What is harassment? What is an example of neglect? What is bullying? What is discrimination? Can you just unpack these just a little bit for us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's a great question. So under the umbrella of abuse, for example, there are different types that you alluded to: psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. Those are the main breakdown types of abuse, and really, it in all of them, it's a pattern of behavior. From the psychological point of view, defined as a pattern of deliberate, prolonged, repeated behaviors. They're non-physically contacted in nature. And it's within that power differential that we talked about. So the person who's the receiver of this is kind of perceived on a lower level than the person who is given it to them. And oftentimes from a psychological point of view, it's targeting very personal things. So the perpetrator is saying personal things or suggesting very personal things to this person, and it really strikes them at the core. And the repeated nature of it just means that it wasn't just a one-time deal. It's happening over and over again, and it has a profound effect on that individual that's quite harmful. That's from the psychological point of view. From the physical point of view, that's when we start to see intentional trauma or physical injury. So there's something directly done physically to that person. It can be hitting, it can be pushing, beating, kicking, biting. And it's hard to imagine this happens in sports, but it does, which is why it needs to be mentioned. From a sexual abuse point of view, it's really any contact of a sexual nature with a person of any age. And that's what I really want to accentuate. It can happen to adults too. And people assume that adults can avoid these situations or get themselves out of these situations or prevent it from happening. But in the context of a power differential relationship, they really can't. It's perpetrated without consent, in an aggressive or exploitative way, or a threatening or manipulative way, where the person actually doesn't feel that they can give consent. They really have no choice. It just happens. And it's, again, that physical sexual nature. So that constitutes sort of the abuse part of it. The harassment part, there's more subsections to the harassment piece, because it can cross more kind of boundaries. And there we also have, psychological or emotional harassment, physical, sexual, there's gender-based, and this is where it really becomes person-focused. You can run into race-based harassment and homophobia. So again, these are more comments, coerced behaviors, violation of human rights. This is where we really get into the human rights aspect of things. Again, the very personal side, but it's, again, based on the abuse of power and trust by a person of authority. So that hierarchy is there, the differential of power is there, and it is, again, it's a repeated pattern of behavior that does cause harm on the individual. Neglect, in particular, is kind of it's the opposite of doing. It's a done act, but it's kind of the withdrawal of something. So a person's not able to do something. So they're, in the example I talked about earlier with the team where there was a differential treatment within that team, for one of the victims, she really described neglect in the sense that she wasn't coached. She just wasn't given any attention. She was actually excluded from team drills, and because she wouldn't go along with what was being what the inappropriate behavior or what was happening within the team. So she was left out of team events intentionally. Her teammates were told not to talk to her, were told not to associate with her by the coach. And she became what we would call radioactive. No one wanted to touch her because they would fear repercussions. So that's a form of neglect. Being told not to access physical treatment or medical treatment, being told not to go to class, anything where someone is prevented from accessing something that they really need, whether it's psychologically, emotionally, physically, that would be constituted by neglect. Bullying we see, I mean, bullying and hazing, we're sort of under the same umbrella, and I think most sport organizations around the world have at least superficially stated that hazing is banned. We do know that initiation, orientation, welcoming to the team still happens. But again, that's a part of bullying. So bullying is, again, unwanted, repeated, intentional behavior, typically peer-based. So the power differential comes from within a group, but it's more like vets to rookies, for example, or a larger subgroup of a group versus a smaller subgroup of a group. But there's that same intimidation factor, and a person, it's unwanted and they feel intimidated by it. So discrimination, finally, consists of, again, making distinctions between groups of individuals. So there's something being made, someone is different than somebody else for some reason, and that is being accentuated or magnified or pointed out. And so one of those groups is being treated very differently, typically in a more negative way. They may have opportunities withheld from them, or denied to them. And oftentimes it can be based on external characteristics like skin color, body shape, gender. We get in, there's, gender in sports is a hot topic right now. We may not get into that today, which is totally fine because we could spend a couple of days on that one. But a lot of these things are very polarizing. And although there have been some efforts made by a lot of different leagues for diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think most people in some of those commonly discriminated against groups would still say it's still happening.
Thank you so much for unpacking all of that. And again, I just think it's so important because it helps us to think about the actions, the behaviors, the communication that we see on a day-to-day basis in these environments, or perhaps that we don't want to see in these environments. And I think some things are obvious, and other things that are less than obvious. So having clear definitions, I think, is really, really important. Now, look, I've perhaps written some things down here that one might perceive to be pretty obvious in terms of where they're placed or how they're managed, but I'm not too sure that they are. I know from my own work speaking with coaches who are trying to find, let's say, optimal ways to deliver in their coaching practice in order to, let's say, support and stretch. Dan, how do I stretch my athletes in the safest and healthiest possible way? When you were speaking there about abuse, for instance, I wrote down two very simple words: shouting and insistence. I mean, let's just park there for a second. Something as obvious as shouting at somebody, something as perhaps obvious as being insistent about an action or a drill or a standard of behavior. What would your response be to shouting and insistence? And I know I'm dealing with very broad brush areas here, but what are your thoughts there?
It's a great question, and sometimes it's a fine line because you can argue that people like being coached in different ways. Some people like to be yelled at. Some people
Yes.
want to be told very specifically what they need to do, whereas some people need a much different approach. What I usually tell coaches is know your athletes and know that one approach is not going to fit all, but also know the boundaries and the thresholds for appropriate versus inappropriate. And sometimes that lies in the words that you choose You don't want to call people names. It's not helpful to call people names. It's not helpful to make nicknames that are based on what they look like or something maybe silly that they've done before. Those things will be humiliating for them. Those things may be embarrassing for them. So I think, what I often tell coaches is really try to understand the impact that what you're saying is going to have on the other person. I say the same thing for athletes and anybody else too. Is what you're saying going to be helpful or is it going to be harmful? Is what you're going to say being based in emotion right now, or is it actually something that is quite intentional and you actually have a clear message that you want to get across? I think in sport, obviously, there's a lot of passion and emotions and intensity at times, and a lot of people can get wrapped up in that. But ultimately, a harmful act or a harmful statement is something that lasts for a very, very long time, if not for life, for a lot of people. So even though it's maybe trivial, for some, it actually can be quite impactful. So again, the words that you choose is really important, and the way that it is delivered. In the team example that I gave before, I think I keep going back to that because I think it captures so many of these things. The athletes were repeatedly told by the staff around this coach, don't focus on how it's delivered, focus on what the message is itself. And so they were trying to soften it. And some of these, even the mental performance consultant for this team told me once, I'm not going to change the coach. So I'm just going to soften the blow and give them a soft place to fall when they get hit. And I think that was not a good approach for that. I think, a lot of things needed to change there, but the delivery needs to be appropriate. The delivery cannot be harmful or humiliating. The tone of voice is important. You can be forceful and assertive without, again, being harmful.
Demanding but not demeaning.
100%. I really like that. Demanding but not demeaning. I've had some sport organizations ask me to talk to coaches or to talk to athletes about, them understanding that assertive coaching is not abusive coaching. So both sides are really trying to have some safety in what they do. And I know that a lot of coaches have felt afraid of being complained about. In Canada, we now have an Office for the Sport Integrity Commissioner, and anybody and everybody involved with high performance sport in Canada had to sign a contract that said, anybody can complain about you, and if you get complained about, you'll get suspended, and you'll have it may be published and all of this. So everybody was instantly afraid of vexatious or frivolous complaints. A lot of coaches are afraid if an athlete is not selected or if they're not given enough playing time and if they're not started, then that will cause the athlete to launch a complaint of some sort about discrimination or lack of access or abuse of some sort. So I think there's fear on the other side too. But again, what I would say is, you establish a safe environment. Even, you check in with the athletes before you do anything. We have a rule of 2 here in Canada where no coach can be alone with an athlete. Doesn't matter, same sex or other sex, including treatment. Any treatment professionals has to have either the door open or somebody else in the room with them for safety of everybody. It would be safety against frivolous complaints, but also safety of the athlete so that nothing, untowards would happen. And I would say, even if, a coach or a practitioner or whomever just asked the athlete if they were fine doing something by themselves, we can't always know that the athlete actually feels safe with that. Again, because of the power differential, they may feel that they have to say okay, even if they don't feel that it's okay. So I think having a basic rule of at least 2 helps prevent a lot of the potential harm that could happen.
So much of what you've said there resonates with me, and even just going back to that basic notion of shouting at a player, which is something that, makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable at times. I've been in changing rooms where it's been very shouty, and I know at the adult elite level or the professional level, if you want to call it that, a lot of players or coaches would say to me, "Oh, come on, Dan, this is the way it is in our environment." And to speak to your point, I interacted with many players who said, "Actually, Dan, I like it when the coach has a go at me. It G's me up." But I always wonder how much that opinion is an opinion that is oriented from the socio-cultural nature of the history of coaching in that specific sport. And I've always felt, as a sports psychology practitioner, that I can express intensity and urgency through my words without shouting. I'm passionate about the craft of coaching, the craft of communication, and let's play about with our tone.
Correct.
Let's express urgency. Let's turn up the volume of intensity here. I'm not too sure I have to shout at someone to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I also recognize that if you were to ask me to write down the top 10, let's say, soccer, football managers of all time, there's a whole bunch of them in there who probably led through a culture of fear and possibly did a lot of shouting. And I know that there would be a lot of
Yes.
ex-players now who would say, well, that person did me the world of good. So there's an enormous amount of nuance and complexity in there, isn't there?
Yes, and I think there can be, when we think about maltreatment, a lot of the definitions are as it applies to the effect on a person, or it can be a group of people. However, we can think of an environment. You're speaking to some coaches have a more intense environment where there is more yelling, and that is how communication is done, but it's not necessarily communicated or directed at a certain person. So I think there can be a difference there. I think most athletes, as they advance through the various levels, understand that the pro levels where there's a lot on the line, there's going to be more intensity, and I think they can come to expect that in certain coaches or in certain environments. However, when we think about the Spanish women's soccer team, who last year 15 of them left and said, I'm not playing for the national team because the environment is so toxic. So it'd be interesting to know, what were the toxic elements of that environment? Was it just a yelly, harsh critical environment to everybody, or was it actually quite unsafe from a psychological point of view, from a personal safety, whether it's physical or sexual point of view? I don't know all the details there, but I mean, there's lots of stuff on the stage right now for the Spanish women's team. So there's going to be a few answered or questions being answered, I hope, in the near future. But again, we can look at the environment, which I think is the responsibility of the organization to really police and make sure it's an appropriate environment, and the athletes hopefully can have a big voice in influencing what that looks like.
It's certainly a complex landscape, and you know just reflecting on certain things that have gone on there, as you said, in the Women's World Cup, winning doesn't necessarily correlate with a healthy and safe environment. Equally, a healthy and safe environment doesn't necessarily relate to winning. And I mean, do you feel some empathy for coaches, especially at the very highest level, who live in a world where results define their career? And so subsequently they're trying to find ways to bring players out of their comfort zone, if you like, to uh, engage them in excellence every single day. Do you feel some empathy there for their challenge, and perhaps how sometimes their behaviors can spill into something that might be considered as maltreatment?
Absolutely. I've worked with coaches from all sides of that spectrum, in terms of those who really respect their players, really respect the environment, respect the staff, and have a very human approach to things. I can tell you that across the board, that kind of coach is respected by all the players. I've been in a situation where that kind of coach hasn't had a winning record necessarily, and they really struggle with, you know, should I be this kind of coach, or should I be a different kind of coach? Then would that have more outcomes, in terms of wins on the win column? And I really cherish the conversations that I have with coaches around this. It's helpful to get their insight on things, but also to try to help them understand too, what is meaningful for the players, and what is not. So all the coaches that I know at that level read a lot of books, and they read books from a lot of different types of coaches, and again, they're trying to find the right formula for themselves. But I think um, you know I admire the Spanish women's team for winning despite the environment, and I hope they get better support. And I think they would win if they had a better environment. I think it really speaks to the women for what they were able to do. But in terms of an environment, um, again, I think by the time a coach reaches that level, for the most part, most of them have a style, and they've had a style for a long period of time, and they either get results or they don't. And for the coaches who are not getting results, to consider switching to a harsher style, I would suspect that wouldn't turn out as well, because it's not who they are. It would result likely in inconsistent messaging, and it would result in confusion from the players. So I would always support, an approach that's going to be able to engage each player on a level that's going to work for them and a level that's going to work for the coach, in an environment that works for everybody in terms of safety and comfort, and letting everybody have an opportunity to feel like they can show up and do their job without fear.
I've got two more broad questions for you, one around youth sport and one around fitness. Let's start with fitness. Again, I think it's an area coaches, whether it's at the college level, the adult level, how do I stretch players around fitness and thinking of strength and conditioning, body shape, eating habits, and so on and so forth, the physical side of things. How do I stretch players there in as healthy and safe way as I possibly can? I'm sure you have plenty of conversations with coaches here on that topic, and I have found that it's something that coaches are striving to do as efficaciously, as authentically, as safe and as healthy as they can. What advice do you have for coaches out there who are trying to stretch athletes from a fitness perspective, but do so without engaging in any kind of harassment?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Dan. It's a really important one, and I'm sure you and I both appreciate the importance of words, both again as the words that are chosen and how it's delivered. And I truly believe that this message around optimal physical condition for performance can be delivered in a way that's rooted in health and well-being, and with performance attached, without ever having to say, weight, fat, thickness, heavy. I always encourage, coaches to have and anyone to have a list of do's and don'ts, in terms of, do use these words, don't use these words, because there are certain words that we know are actually going to be harmful, and the message that is received, I mean, if the message is you need to lose weight, then it will be received, but it won't be received in a healthy way, and can ultimately lead to disordered eating or eating disordered behaviors, which ultimately is not obviously in the person's best interest. So I always encourage folks to use words such as health, fitness, balance, strength, strong, performance, but really, really anchoring it in the health words and avoiding the other things, but also pairing the message with intention. So, how can we work on your overall fitness and how you're feeling from a body and mind point of view? So tying the mental part of it as well, body dysmorphia and, body, preoccupation can be very negative for athletes, and again lead to disordered eating behaviors and such. So facilitating a healthy body image is really important. Tying it with performance can be helpful, but using the healthy words for that. I work with the National Ballet of Canada as well, and had a great conversation with the artistic director, who really wanted some guidance about, within that culture, how can these messages be delivered in a healthy way? We know that in dancers and performance artists, oftentimes there is eating disordered behaviors, or disordered eating, stress fractures, etc. And a lot of it is the culture and way that the messages are given. But so again, in that conversation, it was really about anchoring it to health, well-being, strength, fitness, and offering opportunities to help facilitate that while working with a nutritionist, sport dietitian, strength and conditioning coach, professionals who can guide that same intention, without then the athlete or performing artists, making it up as they go, and maybe choosing unhealthy behaviors to achieve what they think the coach is asking them to do.
My final question is around youth sport. I know that there are very many youth coaches who are passionate about what they do. They're passionate about helping. They often coach, not always. They're often coaching players at what might be considered participative level. It's for fun. And I think hopefully there are coaches out there who are giving young people that opportunity to just simply participate, because sometimes we just think that sports coaching is about trying to help everybody reach the elite, which just is desperately untrue. But maybe for those who are engaged in programs, coaching programs, where they are striving to help young people realize how good they can become, and there are roadmaps. They have to stretch players. They have to introduce them to certain behaviors, certain habits that might be linked to striving to be the very best that you can be. Again, I think coaches have to have that vocabulary, and I'm asking this question here. Players have to have a vocabulary for young people, a sense of healthy and safe communication with young people in order to guide them on that journey, because I think too often insistence can not just lead to resistance, but it leads to burnout. It leads to leaving the sport. Mm-hmm. That early seriousness can be a real problem. And again, the early seriousness can lead to a sense of harassment. Any thoughts you have there?
Yeah, you hit it on the nose there. We know that the highest dropout rate for young athletes is between the ages of 13 and 15. It's an extremely high dropout rate. And there have been a lot of studies around why that is. And you're exactly right. So one is it got too serious and wasn't fun anymore. And another one is, parents tend to coach after they leave the sporting venue. So again, when the focus is too serious, especially in youth athletes, and I have young athletes as young as 10 or 11 that I'm working with, and already the messages that we're given at that age are, you have to be better than someone else, and you have to be all about the game. But I think, and it's really hard. It's hard to communicate with the coaches at that level because we just don't have access to them. Yeah. I think the message to youth sports needs to come through the organization. So I think there needs to be a lot of education about that. Here in Canada, we have an excellent Coaching Association of Canada that provides free education to all coaches in all sports at every level on an annual basis. It talks about mental health. They talk about nutrition. They talk about healthy balance, communication. So I think, it would be really important for all of the youth sport organizations with a lot of volunteer coaches to provide them with opportunities to learn these. And maybe they just don't know. Maybe they don't know the optimal way to communicate these things, or maybe they're unaware of sport for life trajectories and appropriate communication and drills and practices and expectations in terms of physical development at different age groups, and mental development at different age groups, and cognitive development to different age groups. So if they don't know, they don't know. And so I think there is a responsibility to help them understand that. So likely, or hopefully, their approaches will be more appropriate at those levels.
Brilliant. Carla, what a fantastic conversation, and a tough one to have, and not easy to unpack. But I know that you will have tapped the interest of everybody listening in. So how can people find you, follow you, and read your paper and any other papers that you may have produced?
Yeah, thanks for asking. On the X platform, formerly known as Twitter, my handle is at Edwards10Carla. Happy to have any followers there. I try to post important content there and access to papers. I'm on ResearchGate as well. For anybody who's an academic, they can contact me there to have any of the papers that I've written. In my personal website here in Canada, I have a private clinic called Synergy Sport Plus Mental Health. It's a long website, synergysportmentalhealth.ca, synergysportmentalhealth.ca, Synergy Sport Mental Health, just spelled out there. And my email address is on that as well if anybody needed to reach out to me.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Carla. Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to know what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook, or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.